Hello and welcome. Today we are going to sew the perfect pajama top that will be a set with the shorts I made in my last video. And for this top I will be using a pattern from a vintage Burda magazine. I bought this magazine secondhand. So as you can see, it is in very bad conditions. I really liked one design with a big collar and buttons in the front, short sleeves and the V-shaped neckline. However, I am going to do some adjustments to the pattern. First of all, because it comes in sizes from 24 up. So I am going to scale it down. I am planning to scale it down 2 sizes. So I have 38, size 38. And I am also going to crop it a little bit because the original pattern has like a slit at the hip and is quite long. And as I am making like a pajama top with the shorts, I am going to just cut it so I have just like a normal length, let's say a little bit cropped, still like a boxy fit or a little bit oversized. And yeah, that is the plan. Let's start sewing. I started by cutting out all the pattern pieces. 2 fronts mirrored, 1 back cut on the fold, 2 front facings mirrored and 1 back facing cut on the fold, 2 sleeves mirrored and 2 collars cut on the fold. The first step is to sew the darts, so I marked with a marker where the dart points are and pinned, then sewed them with a straight stitch. Then I sewed the shoulders right sides together and repeated the same for the facings. I used the straight stitch 3 millimeters long. Then I ironed the seams and overlocked all the raw edges. The next step is to prepare the collar. I put the collar pieces right sides together and sewed along the shorter sides and the longer part with a straight 3 millimeter stitch, leaving the shorter edge open. Then I ironed the seams open, cut off the excess seam allowances, and this is what the collar is looking like after I turned it right sides out. Even after ironing, the edges of the collar were not very defined, so I decided to sew all the seam allowances to the back of the collar flap to give some structure without having visible seams on the front of the collar. So now our collar is ready to be sewn to the blouse. I found the middle point of the collar and the back and the middle point of the back of the blouse and pinned. From this point, I evenly pinned the collar to the neckline of the blouse, then sewed with a long stitch. I could have hand basted. This is only to hold the collar in place and make the next step easier. So after pinning the collar, I applied the previously prepared facing to the collar
along the line of the front and the neckline. I started by connecting the rounded edges of the neckline and the shoulder seams, and then pinned the rest. I sewed from the bottom through the neckline and the neck area to the other side of the blouse with a 3mm straight stitch. I made little cuts on the rounded edges of the seam allowances, being very careful not to cut the seam itself. Then I sewed the edge of the facing with an overlock. I could have done it earlier, but I wanted to sew it to the neckline first to see if it was wide enough. Then I sew again all around the neckline, sewing the edges, sewing the seam allowances to the facing so that the seams are invisible from the front. Now we can join the sides of the blouse with the right sides together and sew with a 3mm straight stitch. Here I make sure that the front darts are facing down. The bodice is almost finished, so let's move on to the sleeves. I folded the side edges, right sides together and sewed. I ironed the allowances open and sewed with an overlocker. At this point, my camera battery died, so I had to postpone finishing the blouse until the next day. So, with the blouse turned inside out, I pinned the sleeves to the armholes, a slightly wider edge of the sleeve to the back of the blouse, and the shorter one to the front. I started pinning from the seam under the armpit and pinned the material all the way up. I deliberately cut the sleeves larger. I didn't scale them down to a size smaller like I did for the other pattern pieces, just to pull the material at the top and make a little puff at the shoulder. So I sewed about 10 centimeters at the top of the sleeve with a 5mm stitch and pulled on one of the threads to form a gathering. Then I sewed the sleeve around with a straight stitch. I checked if I like the gathering and if all the stitches are even. Then I could pull the threads from the top used for gathering out and sew the seam allowance with an overlocker. Now it's time to hem the edges of the sleeves and the bottom of the blouse. I wrapped the sleeve material twice, once by 0.5 centimeter and the second time by about 2.5 centimeters, and sew around with a straight stitch. For the bottom edge, first I place the facing and the edge of the blouse right sides together and sew this little corner right until the end of the facing. I cut off the excess seam allowances and sew the bottom edge with an overlocker. Now I turn the corners of the blouse right side out and sew the bottom edge of the blouse, folding the allowance by about 1/2 centimeter. The last step is to make buttonholes and sew on the buttons. So first I mark the correct positioning of the buttonholes. And for the buttons, I chose these as small cream colored buttons that I cut out from second-hand fabric that I used for sewing. First, I test the buttonhole on a piece of fabric to make sure everything looks right. Then I sew the buttonholes onto the blouse. I sewed the buttons by hand because it's always more convenient for me than doing it on a machine. And as the last step, I decided to add my label. And that's it. The blouse is ready and I am very pleased with the result. Overall, I think it is a great pattern. So I hope you have enjoyed watching me sew this vintage pattern, and thank you so much for watching and hope to see you next time. Bye!